Right Honorable Prime Minister Sharma Wali, Mr. Kailash Shiroya, it is a pleasure to be here. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. My first time in Nepal, and I've been taking great advantage of it. I've been here for 8 days now, traveling everywhere. A country that reminds me of how small my own country is. Portugal has only 10 million inhabitants, and Nepal 28 million, I believe. Perhaps some people, because of the size of your neighbors, some people in Nepal still think about Nepal as a small country. Well, not where I come from. You would probably be the fourth largest country in the European Union. But also a country that is, throughout its history, a connector of civilizations, of cultures, a center of trade. But more important than a center of trade, a center of ideas. The history of Nepal is a history of connecting great civilizations and connecting cultures, sometimes in an effort that seems almost impossible when we look back. How to bring together the great religions of Hinduism and Buddhism, how to bring together the great ancient civilizations of India and China in a precarious balance and equilibrium, is something that I think is really rather unique in the world. Sometimes Nepal makes me think of the history of Switzerland, but Switzerland, also a country of high mountains, but as I could see in Pokhara, nothing that can be compared to the vision of the Annapurna when you wake up in the morning. Certainly the Mont Blanc in Switzerland does not come close. But like Switzerland, bringing together different cultures, in the case of Switzerland, Italy, Germany, France, but on a much larger scale, on a global scale. And I want to talk a little bit about this in my remarks today. In an op-ed in the Kathmandu Post today, I start by noting the famous golden window in Patan, where a bodhisattva is portrayed as emanating all the Hindu divinities from his body. But remarkably, and I believe this is the artistry of the piece, in the frame around the center, you see, in fact, an image of Shiva, an image of Garuda. So in a way, think about it this way. The superiority, let us call it that way, of Buddhism is affirmed in the central panel, but then in the frame around that central panel, the primacy of Hinduism is reaffirmed again. And you go back and forth between the center and the frame. Those who want to see their immediate convictions reaffirmed in a place of authority, like the golden window, will see them reaffirmed. Those who have a more philosophical disposition will go back and forth between the center and the frame, forcing them to move to a higher plane of reflection and a higher plane of philosophical and spiritual understanding. It is for me a beautiful image of what Nepal has achieved throughout its history, and it will allow me to make a point that I think is important and not always made, although Raja Mohan has already made it with his characteristic brilliance. And that's the point that connectivity is not only about roads and railways. If connectivity were about that, we could delegate it to a group of engineers, a corps of engineers. It is about that, but not only about that. And in fact, the most interesting part is the connectivity between ideas, the connectivity between civilizations, the connectivity between different models. And the rest, by the way, only works when this fundamental sense of connectivity is being developed. Forget about building railways and roads if you have different civilizations battling each other. The fundamental sense of connectivity is how do we bring different cultural worlds, different political models together? And don't believe for a moment that we have moved beyond the historical period where different political models were battling each other. I think the last 2 or 3 years show that we never moved beyond that. We don't have a universal civilization in the sense that we all agree on everything. We have different competing models, and the work, the intellectual, political, spiritual work of bringing these different models together is a work that never ends. And I'll give some examples how we are still in the throes of that fundamental work. The fundamental work is, in fact, an intellectual work where artists, thinkers, religious people are really called to provide the bridge between different ways of thinking about human life and different ways of thinking about the world. Allow me to say that today, when we look at the world, we see a certain naivete when people think about this. And let me tell you that for me, both the American way of looking at it and the Chinese way of looking at it are naive. And we need something more sophisticated. That many times smaller countries like Nepal can provide in a way that larger countries cannot. As smaller countries are turned to the outside, smaller countries are by necessity outward looking, and larger countries are more inward looking. Now, when we hear today strategists in Washington or Beijing, you hear many times from Washington, let me start with that, the idea that the whole world is becoming like America. Just a little more effort, perhaps one or two more invasions here or there, and the whole world will be convinced that there is nothing like a liberal democracy in the American style, and everyone will eventually be converted to it and recognize American leadership in that process. Now, I think we agree that this is a naive way of looking at the world. But from Beijing, we hear something quite similar, in fact. Although people in Beijing and my friends in Beijing would disagree, but we hear something quite similar. That the Belt and Road is a win-win project. That confrontation is never conceived. That everyone will agree. That we can all work together in the Belt and Road, and we have the same fundamental interests. It's in fact an ideology that in some fundamental respects is not so different from the ideology that we hear from Washington. Now, what I want to defend is that in fact it doesn't work like this. We are, in truth, entering a world of conflict between different models. And it's not surprising to me that that is the case. Because, as Raja Mohan so well put it, technology, the worldwide, the global diffusion of technology has a liberating effect. Once technology is something that people essentially all over the world understand and can master, with some differences, I see a world where some countries will be better at some technological areas and others will be better in other areas, but essentially everyone understands how technology works. Engineering schools are just as good in India or in Europe or in America or in Japan. And in that world, countries, on the one hand, are brought together. Technology reduces distance and brings countries together. But on the other hand, they are liberated to pursue their own visions. They're no longer forced to copy. They're no longer forced to defer. They're no longer forced to imitate. They can pursue their own truths and their own instincts. In this world, I think it won't be surprising that different political models will develop and that we will have to deal with the fundamental fact of disagreement in a way that reminds us of the artistry of the golden window in Patan. We need that kind of artistry to bring different truths, different visions together. In fact, as I was contemplating the window in Patan 2 days ago, it immediately seemed to me that what happened over the past 2 decades with America and China was quite similar, because both sides were convinced that the system was working for them. Americans thought that as China grew wealthier, it was becoming like America, and it was helping America grow as well. The Chinese thought that as America remained the global hegemon, it provided the global public goods, the stability, the free trade that China needed to rise itself. So both sides were convinced that the system was in fact their system. The problem we have now is that their way of reconciling two visions came to an end and collapsed over the past 2 years and has to be rebuilt anew. As I say in my op-ed today, we need to rebuild the golden window, and that's the task for the next decade. We have again to bring these two visions together in a way that they can be reconciled in some form. But let me go back to the question of different political models. It is an important question for countries like Nepal, for a country like my own country, Portugal, and for many other countries in this region that are struggling with the question of how to live in the world of geopolitical competition and how to live between all these giants that have a vision for the world as it should be. And I'm thinking of Myanmar, I'm thinking of Kazakhstan, I'm thinking of Singapore. It's a country that is struggling with the sense that we've entered the new world where it will be increasingly difficult to work with both America and China. How do you do this? How do you combine different models? And why is it important? Now, let me refer to a recent visit to Pakistan just a month ago. And as much as I had studied the China-Pakistan economic corridor, it was only in Pakistan that I realized, in fact, that its true meaning, again, is not about roads and railways. Its true meaning is providing a general framework within which economic policy will be conducted in Pakistan in the next 10, 20 years. It is quite remarkable, as you talk to policymakers in Pakistan, that they immediately say, well, because of CPEC, because of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, we have to do this, and we shouldn't do that. They ask the question, what is the best way to take advantage of CPEC? How should we change our own regulations in order to take advantage of CPEC? And then it gets to the point where you're traveling on a bus or you're walking around Islamabad or Lahore, and not being a speaker of Urdu, you do hear the word CPEC almost all the time, constantly, in a cafe or in a bus. Because even people who are not in politics are talking about it. It's the way Pakistan thinks about its future. And the decisions it makes, decisions within the framework of CPEC. That shows the challenges that countries like Pakistan and Nepal and others are facing. Because once you adopt a certain framework, it becomes more difficult to work under a different framework. As Pakistan increasingly adapts its laws and regulations to what China expects, it becomes more difficult for Pakistan to work with America or the European Union. If the public procurement laws that Pakistan adopts are the public procurement laws that exist in China, it will be more difficult for a European company to work in Pakistan. And we should be upfront and honest in recognizing this. Again, goes back to my idea that we don't live in a universal civilization, we have different models. And the challenge, again, is the challenge of the golden window. It's the challenge of bringing these models together. And the challenge of, for smaller countries, the challenge of not being forced to choose. The challenge of working with all sides at the same time. From that point of view, the great task today of bringing these different models together is more in the hands of countries like Nepal than in the hands of the United States and China. Someone said my op-ed today is an optimistic op-ed. It is optimistic in the sense that I do see the work being done to reduce conflict, to increase cooperation, but that work is increasingly being done by smaller countries, for whom it is a vital interest not to enter a world of geopolitical competition. I don't see that fundamental work being very well done by the United States or by China. This is important because it gives smaller countries a task for the future, not just to watch passively as we enter a new Cold War, but to actually make the work of bringing these different models together. It may be intellectually and practically difficult. It may be a challenge that will take many years. It will take skill. It will take, above all, political skill, because as the Golden Window shows us, there's also an element here of political skill. The Mala kings were trying to convince two constituencies that they had the dominant position. And in a way, smaller countries will have to convince the United States and China that both have a dominant position. Any other option is, of course, puts us on the road to increasing conflict and confrontation. So let me conclude by saying that this great task of bringing civilizations together is more than ever in the hands of smaller countries. It's more than ever in the hands of countries that spend their time looking at the world outside, that cannot afford to look inwards, and that in a way also have their vision for the world as it should be in the coming decades. Nepal can look proudly to its history and realize that on a scale even larger than the scale that is necessary today, it has already accomplished this task in the past. Thank you very much.